when Christ is the night before the crucifixion, which in principle he knows is coming, he asks God to relieve him of his burden. And understandably so. I mean, that's the scene famously in which he's sweating, literally sweating blood, because he knows what's coming. And the Romans designed crucifixion to be the most agonizing and humiliating possible, agonizing, humiliating, and disgusting possible death. Right. So there was every reason to be apprehensive about that. And you might say, well, could you undertake that voluntarily as an adventure? And the answer to that is something like, well, what's your relationship with death? Like, that's a problem you have to solve. And you could fight it and you could be bitter about it. And there's reasons for that, especially if it's painful and degrading. But the alternative is something like, well, it's what's fleshed out in religious imagery always. It's very difficult to cast into words. It's like, no, you welcome the struggle. That's why I called the book, We Who Wrestle with God. You welcome the struggle. And Lex, I don't see how you can come to terms with life without construing it as something like, bring it on, welcome the struggle. And I can't see that there's a limit to that. It's like, well, I welcome the struggle until it gets difficult. Well,
so there's not a bell curve, like the struggle in moderation. Basically, you have to welcome whatever as hard as it gets. And the crucifixion in that way is a symbol
of that. Well, and it's worse than that in some ways, because the crucifixion exemplifies the worst possible death. But that isn't the only element of the struggle, because mythologically, classically, after Christ's death, he harrows hell. And what that means, as far as I can tell, psychologically, is that you're not only required, let's say, to take on the full existential burden of life and to welcome it, regardless of what it is, and to maintain your upward aim despite all temptations to the contrary, but you also have to confront the root of malevolence itself. So it's not merely tragedy. And I think the malevolence is actually worse. And the reason I think that is because I know the literature on post-traumatic stress disorder. And most people who encounter, let's say, a challenge that's so brutal that it fragments them, it isn't mere suffering that does that to people. It's an encounter with malevolence that does that to people. Their own sometimes, often, by the way. Soldier will go out into a battlefield and find out that there's a part of him that really enjoys the mayhem. And that conceptualization doesn't fit in well with everything he thinks he knows about himself and humanity. And after that contact with that dark part of himself, he never recovers. That happens to people. And it happens to people who encounter bad actors in the world too. If you're a naive person and the right narcissistic psychopath comes your way, you are in like mortal trouble because you might die, but that's not where the trouble ends.